The wine shimmered with a neon green swirl that shouldn't have been there. In a $2,000 bottle of vintage Merlot, that color was a death sentence. Kessia Monroe noticed. Her boss, the Korean Mafia kingpin Jin Kairo, was too busy tearing her dignity to shreds to see it. He sat just inches away, his voice cold as he mocked her in front of his associates for a smudge on a plate that wasn't even there. Kessia watched his fingers brush the stem of the glass. 5 seconds. That was the window. 5 seconds to speak up and save the man who treated her like a piece of the furniture, or stay silent and let the poison do what she couldn't. But as the room laughed at his latest insult, Kessia didn't shout a warning. She didn't tip the glass over. Instead, she stepped into the light, reached for the wine, and drank it herself. But here is what the men at that table didn't understand. Kessia didn't drink it to be a hero. She didn't do it out of a servant's loyalty. She drank it because she was tired of being a ghost in a house she kept spotless. Part of her drank it because, in that moment, the hospital or the grave felt more like home than this uniform ever did. 3 years of being the help does that to a woman. It makes you realize that sometimes, the only way to be seen is to stop breathing. This is Kessia. 26 years old, brilliant, observant, and completely discarded. For 1,000 days, she has managed the Kairo estate with surgical precision, ironing the shirts he wears to kill people, cooking the meals he eats while ignoring her existence. She has become a master of the background. So essential that she is effectively invisible. Jin Kairo runs an empire built on fear and logistics. To him, Kessia is just a line item on a budget, a tool that performs a function. He thinks he's the most dangerous man in the room. He thinks he has thought of every threat, every traitor, and every escape route. He's wrong. Because in the high-stakes world of the Kairo syndicate, there is one rule the bosses always forget. Never humiliate the person who sees everything you miss. Tonight, in the private suite of the Sapphire Lounge, under the soft glow of the recessed lighting and the smell of expensive tobacco, that rule was about to be broken. On the left, Kessia. Classic black and white uniform, headpiece pinned perfectly. The image of a subordinate. But her eyes aren't on the floor tonight. In the center, Jin Kairo. Tailored black suit, jaw clenched in a sneer, leaning forward to deliver one last biting comment. His phone is buzzing with a multi-million-dollar shipment. He's in total control. On the right, the associate. Hands pressed to his mouth, eyes wide, watching the glass. Everything is frozen in the exact second before the world explodes. The sun hadn't yet crested the manicured hedges of the Kairo estate when Kessia's alarm vibrated against her bedside table. In the gray, pre-dawn light, she smoothed the wrinkles from her black and white uniform with a mechanical precision born of 3 years of muscle memory. The starch in the collar felt like a thumb pressed against her windpipe, a constant reminder of the role she played, the silent observer, the human shadow, the girl who was paid to be felt but never heard. Walking through the sprawling marble hallways of the mansion was like navigating a museum after hours. Every footfall was cushioned by rugs that cost more than her college tuition, but Kessia moved with the practiced weightlessness of a ghost. She knew which floorboards in the library creaked and which heavy oak doors needed a steady hand to close without a click. To Jin Kairo, silence wasn't just a preference, it was a requirement of her employment. Her day began with the logistics of existence, as she privately called them. She set the table for Jin's breakfast, not just any setting, but a geometry of porcelain and silver. The coffee had to be exactly 175 degrees, the newspaper had to be ironed flat to remove the morning humidity, the chair had to be angled at a precise 30 degrees toward the window. When Jin finally entered the room, he didn't look at her. He didn't offer a good morning or even a grunt of acknowledgement. He simply sat, his eyes already glued to the glowing screen of his phone, and extended his hand. He didn't ask for the coffee, He expected the cup to materialize in his palm at the exact moment his fingers curled. Kessia placed it there, her movements so fluid they seemed automated. "The salt is a quarter-inch too far to the left, Monroe," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. He hadn't looked up from his logistics spreadsheet. He didn't need to. He lived in a world where he felt the slightest imbalance in his environment like a physical itch. "My apologies, sir," Kessia whispered. She adjusted the shaker. He didn't thank her. He simply began to eat, treating her presence as no more significant than the air conditioning humming in the walls. By noon, the weight of the silence began to settle into her bones. It wasn't just the lack of conversation, it was the erasure. As she moved through the house, Jin's associates would pass her in the halls, discussing multi-million-dollar drug shipments and hits on rival families as if she were a piece of decorative molding. They spoke over her, around her, and through her. To them, a black woman in a maid's uniform was a vacuum, a space where information went in but never came out. They didn't realize that while she was scrubbing the baseboards, she was cataloging the names of their offshore accounts. While she was polishing the silver, she was mapping the fractures in their loyalties. The microaggressions were a steady drip of acid. It was the way Jin would drop his damp towel on the floor right next to her hand while she was already on her knees cleaning. It was the way his younger brother, Seo Jun, would use her shoulder as a tripod to steady himself while he adjusted his cufflinks, never once making eye contact. It was the invisible tax she paid every hour, the tax of being a person who saw everything but was seen by no one. As the afternoon sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand foyer, Kessia found herself polishing the heavy crystal chandelier in the dining room. She climbed the ladder, her breath hitching slightly. From this height, she could see the entire layout of the downstairs, the chess pieces of Jin's life. She saw the way the loyal associate, Min-ho, hovered near Jin's private office, his eyes darting toward the security keypad. She saw the tension in the house that no one else seemed to notice because they were too busy being important. She was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but a soul-deep exhaustion that came from holding her breath for 3 years. She looked down at her hands, strong, capable hands that had been reduced to tools for someone else's comfort. The dinner rush began at 5. This was the most dangerous time, the time when Jin's temper was shortest and the house was fullest. Kessia was tasked with prepping the Meridian suite for the evening's high-stakes alliance dinner. As she laid out the white linen, her fingers brushed against a bottle of vintage Merlot waiting on the sideboard. For a split second, she caught her reflection in the polished wood of the table. She looked like a stranger to herself, a silhouette defined by a white apron and a forced posture. "Kessia," a voice snapped. She flinched. It was the first time someone had used her name all day. She turned to see Jin standing in the doorway, his tie half undone, his face a mask of irritation. "The guests will be here in 20 minutes. If I see a single fingerprint on the crystal, I'll have you replaced by morning. Do you understand?" "I understand, Mr. Kairo," she said, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. He didn't wait for her response. He turned and walked away, his mind already back on his empire. He didn't see the way Kessia's jaw tightened. He didn't see the way she looked at the wine glass he would soon be drinking from. He didn't see the woman behind the uniform, and that was his first, and perhaps final, mistake. The invisible shadow was beginning to cast a very long light. The air in the Sapphire Lounge grew heavy with the scent of ozone and expensive cologne as the heavy double doors swung open. This was the theater of the Kairo Syndicate, and tonight, the stage was set for a performance of absolute power. Jin Kairo stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his posture as rigid as the architecture of the house he ruled. Behind him, Kessia stood like a statue in black and white, her hands clasped behind her back, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. To the guests entering the room, she was merely part of the furniture, a decorative piece of the estate's high-end aesthetic. The guests were a collection of sharp suits and sharper eyes. There was Chairman O, an elder in the underworld whose smile never quite reached his predatory eyes, and several mid-level associates looking to climb the ladder by basking in Jin's reflected glow. But it was Minho, Jin's longtime associate, who drew Kessia's silent focus. He didn't enter with the boisterous confidence of the others. Instead, he lingered at the periphery, his movements jittery, like a man waiting for a storm to break. Chairman O, Jin's voice rang out, a smooth baritone that commanded the room's oxygen. The Merlot is from a private vineyard in Bordeaux. I think you'll find it suits the gravity of our agreement. Kessia stepped forward to begin the service. This was the dance she had performed 1,000 times. She moved clockwise, tilting the heavy bottle with a steady hand, ensuring not a single drop marred the pristine white linen. As she reached Chairman O, she felt the weight of his gaze, not on her face, but on her hands, as if he were checking for a tremor that would betray her humanity. He said nothing to her, continuing his conversation with Jin about shipping routes in the port of Savannah as if she were a mechanical pourer. When she reached Minho, the air seemed to chill. He was sitting to Jin's right, his hands pressed together so tightly his knuckles were white. As Kessia leaned in to fill his glass, he flinched, his elbow nearly knocking the bottle from her grip. "Watch it," he hissed, his eyes darting to Jin before settling on Kessia with a look of pure venom. "My apologies, sir," Kessia murmured, her voice a ghost of a sound. She noticed it then, the way Minho's gaze kept drifting to Jin's untouched glass at the head of the table. It wasn't the look of a man admiring fine wine, it was the look of a man watching a fuse burn down. He wiped a bead of sweat from his upper lip, despite the room being kept at a precise 68 degrees. His behavior was a jagged edge in a room full of polished surfaces, a frequency of panic that only someone trained to live in the silence could hear. Jin, however, was in his element. He was a master of the ego, playing his guests like instruments. He leaned back, his Tom Ford suit catching the amber glow of the chandelier, and began a monologue on loyalty, the kind of speech men in his position gave when they wanted to remind everyone who held the leash. "Loyalty is a rare currency," Jin said, his eyes scanning the table, stopping for a fraction of a second on Minho. "Many claim to have it. Few can afford the price when the bill comes due." The table erupted in polite, sycophantic laughter. Kessia retreated to the sideboard, her eyes never leaving the table. From her vantage point, she saw what no one else did. As the laughter peaked and Jin turned his head to address Chairman O, Minho's hand moved. It was a blur of motion, a subtle flick of the wrist over Jin's glass. A tiny, crystalline shimmer fell into the red liquid. It didn't splash, it dissolved instantly, sending a microscopic ripple to the edge of the crystal. To anyone else, it might have looked like a trick of the light, a reflection of the chandelier above. But Kessia saw the truth. She saw the faint, neon-green swirl that momentarily clouded the deep red of the Merlot before vanishing into the depths. Minho pulled his hand back, his face a mask of feigned composure, though his chest was hollowing out with rapid breaths. He looked at Jin, his brother and boss, with a mixture of terror and anticipation. Kessia's heart began to drum a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The room felt suddenly smaller, the oxygen thinner. The ego in the room was so thick it was a physical weight, blinding the powerful men to the treachery sitting right beside them. Jin reached out, his long fingers closing around the stem of his glass. He lifted it slightly, swirling the wine, the movement causing the poison to mix perfectly with the vintage. He began to raise the glass to his lips, preparing a toast that would seal the alliance, and his own fate. Kessia stood in the shadows, the invisible shadow of the Kairo estate, realizing that the 3 years of silence were about to end in a single, devastating moment. The clock in her head started ticking. 5 seconds. That was all the time left before the world changed forever. The stem of the glass was halfway to Jin Kairo's lips when he paused, his eyes narrowing as they caught on something near the base of his dinner plate. The conversation at the table died instantly. In the Kairo household, a pause from the boss was rarely a prelude to anything but a storm. Kessia felt the shift in the room's temperature before he even spoke. She stood a few feet back, her hands neatly folded, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. "Monroe," Jin said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. He didn't look back at her. He simply pointed a manicured finger at the rim of the porcelain. "What is this?" Kessia stepped forward, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. She leaned in slightly, looking at the spot he indicated. To the naked eye, there was nothing but the gleam of bone china under the chandelier. "I don't see anything, sir." "A smudge," he hissed, the word cutting through the silence like a blade. "A dull, greasy thumbprint on the edge of a plate being used to serve a chairman. Do you have any idea how much effort I put into the aesthetics of this evening? How much I paid for perfection?" He looked up then, his jaw tight, his dark eyes burning with a cold, calculated fury. This wasn't about a smudge. This was about power. This was about reminding everyone at the table, especially the jittery Min-ho, that Jin Kairo saw every flaw, every weakness, every minute transgression. "I apologize, Mr. Kairo." "Let me replace it immediately," Kessia said, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. She reached for the plate, but Jin slammed his palm onto the table, making the crystal jump. "No," he snapped. "You don't get to just hide your incompetence. You'll stand there. Right there. Since you find the details so beneath you, you can watch us eat and contemplate why you're still allowed in this house." A few of the associates chuckled, a cruel, sycophantic sound. Min-ho didn't laugh, he remained frozen, his gaze fixed on the wine glass that Jin had set back down just inches from the plate. The humiliation was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that made Kessia's vision blur for a fraction of a second. She was a woman with a degree, a woman with a family who loved her, reduced to a prop in a madman's theater. She stood where he commanded, exposed and degraded in the center of the room. It was in this forced stillness, this moment of absolute, crushing visibility, that her eyes settled on the Merlot. The light from the chandelier overhead hit the liquid at a sharp angle. Because she was standing, not sitting, and because she was positioned directly under the glow of the amber lights, she saw what the seated men could not. At the very bottom of the glass, a tiny, viscous swirl of neon green was performing a slow, lethal dance. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, a chemical anomaly that had no business being in a vintage red. Her breath hitched. She looked at Min-ho. His hands were shaking now, his eyes darting between the glass and Jin's face. The betrayal was written in the sweat on his brow, the frantic rhythm of his pulse visible in his neck. Jin reached for the glass again, his irritation from the smudge seemingly satisfied by the sight of Kessia's forced submission. "To new beginnings," he said, lifting the poison toward his mouth. Kessia had 3 seconds. In those seconds, 3 years of ignored good mornings, dropped towels, and mocked dignity flashed through her mind. If she stayed silent, the man who had just tried to break her spirit would be dead before dessert. She could walk out the door, take her final paycheck from the estate's automated system, and never look back. But then she looked at the wine again. She looked at the green shimmer, and then at the arrogant, oblivious man holding it. A sudden, visceral realization hit her: if she let him die, she was still just a spectator in his world. She was still the girl who let things happen to her. She didn't want him to die. Not like this. And she didn't want to be a ghost anymore. "Mr. Kairo," she said, her voice ringing out with a clarity that stopped his hand mid-air. Jin stopped, the rim of the glass a mere inch from his lips. He turned his head slowly, his expression one of pure disbelief that she had dared to speak again. "I believe I told you to be silent, Monroe." "The wine," she said, stepping toward him, ignoring the gasps from the associates. "It's not to your standard." Before he could react, before his security could move, Kessia reached out. Her hand was rock steady as she took the glass from his fingers. The room went deathly quiet. Minho looked like he was about to vomit. Kessia looked Jin Kairo in the eye, the first time she had truly looked at him in 3 years, and raised the glass. "Let me show you what perfection looks like," she whispered. Then, she drank. The wine hit Kessia's tongue with a metallic, bitter tang that the expensive Merlot couldn't mask. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and as it slid down her throat, it felt less like liquid and more like a slow-moving fire. She didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on Jin Kairo's, watching the transition in his expression from irritation to a confused, mounting horror. For a heartbeat, the world remained frozen. The crystal glass in Kessia's hand was empty, save for a single drop of neon green residue clinging to the rim. Then, the fire in her chest bloomed. The glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the mahogany table. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. Kessia tried to breathe, but her lungs felt as though they were being filled with setting concrete. She reached for her throat, her fingers clawing at the starched white collar of the uniform that had defined her for 3 years. The perfect posture she had maintained since dawn buckled. "Monroe." Jin's voice was no longer cold, it was fractured. He stood up so abruptly his chair scraped back and toppled. Kessia didn't answer. She couldn't. The room began to spin, the chandelier overhead turning into a swirling vortex of amber light. She took one stumbling step back, away from the table, away from the power and the ego, and collapsed into the center of the room. She hit the floor hard, the white linen of her apron splaying out around her like broken wings. The invisible shadow was now the only thing anyone could see. Chaos erupted. Chairman O stood up, knocking over his own wine, while the other associates scrambled back as if the floor itself had become lethal. But Minho was the most visible of all. He had slumped against the table, his face the color of ash, his hands shaking so violently he looked like he was having a seizure of his own. Jin Kairo, the man who prided himself on never losing his composure, was over the table in a second. He didn't call for his guards. He didn't ask for a medic. He dropped to his knees in the middle of the dining room, his expensive black suit soaking up the spilled wine on the floor as he reached for her. "Kessia," he shouted, and for the first time in 3 years, the name sounded like it belonged to a person, not a servant. He pulled her into his lap, his large hands cradling her head. Kessia's eyes were wide, fixed on the ceiling, her pupils dilating as the toxin began to shut down her nervous system. She saw his face hovering above hers, the jaw no longer clenched in a sneer, but trembling with a raw, primal panic. He looked down at the woman he had just humiliated, the woman he had treated as disposable, and saw the life flickering out of her because she had chosen to take his place. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Why did you do it?" Kessia tried to form a word, but only a thin trail of dark liquid escaped the corner of her mouth. She wanted to tell him that she hadn't done it for him. She wanted to tell him that she had done it to stop being the girl who polished his shoes while he planned his wars. She had traded her silence for a scream that the whole room had to hear. "Get the car!" Jin screamed at his men, his voice vibrating through Kessia's chest. "Now! If she dies, you all die." As Jin gathered her into his arms, lifting her with an effortless strength he usually reserved for violence, the power dynamic of the Kairo estate dissolved. The maid was gone. In her place was a dying woman who had just become the most powerful person in the room by simply refusing to stay invisible. As the world faded into a cold, dark gray, the last thing Kessia felt wasn't the pain of the poison, but the frantic, terrifying heat of Jin Kairo's heartbeat against her ear. He was running now, shouting her name over and over, his voice filled with a desperate, burgeoning realization that his empire was nothing compared to the life of the woman he had never bothered to know. The tires of the heavy black SUV screamed against the asphalt as it tore away from the Sapphire Lounge, leaving a trail of burnt rubber and shattered expectations. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with the copper scent of blood and the frantic, shallow gasps of a woman slipping away. Jin Kairo didn't sit in the back with the detached grace of a king, he was on the floor of the vehicle, his knees braced against the leather seats, holding Kessia's limp body against his chest as if he could physically tether her soul to the room. "Drive faster," he roared, the sound tearing from a throat that had only ever used a whisper to command death. Behind the wheel, his lead driver, a man who had survived 3 assassination attempts without breaking a sweat, was visibly trembling. Jin looked down at Kessia. Her head rolled against his shoulder, her dark skin ashen, her lips stained with the remnants of the poison she had intercepted. Every time the car jolted, he tightened his grip. The black silk of his Tom Ford suit was ruined, soaked through with the wine she had vomited and the sweat of his own sudden, violent terror. It occurred to him, with the force of a physical blow, that he didn't even know her middle name. He didn't know if she had a mother waiting for a phone call or a sister who wondered why she worked such long hours for a man who didn't see her. Back at the restaurant, the empire was already beginning to fracture. Without Jin's stabilizing shadow, the dinner guests had scattered like rats from a sinking ship, but his security detail had remained, locked in a state of high-alert paralysis. The realization was sinking in like a cold stone in a deep well. The target hadn't been a rival boss or a disputed territory. The target had been Jin's heart, delivered through a crystal glass of Merlot. It was the wine, Jin whispered into the silence of the speeding car, his eyes wide and fixed on the passing streetlights. She saw it. She saw what I missed. The arrogance that had sustained him for a decade felt like it was dissolving in his veins. He had spent years looking for assassins in the rafters, for snipers on the rooftops, and for wiretaps in his walls. He had never looked at the table. He had never looked at the hand that served him. But Kessia had. While he was belittling her for a fingerprint on a plate, she was scanning the horizon of his safety, identifying a threat he was too self-absorbed to notice. He looked at her hands, the small, calloused hands that had ironed his shirts and polished his floors. They were cold now. He tucked them into the warmth of his own palms, an act of intimacy that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. "Stay with me, Monroe," he commanded, though the command lacked its usual bite. It sounded more like a plea. "Do you hear me? You don't get to leave yet. I haven't finished the conversation." He knew exactly what the conversation was. It was the 6 years of silence he owed her. It was the thousands of ignored greetings and the casual cruelties he had dispensed like candy. If she died a martyr for a man who had treated her like a ghost. The thought was unbearable. It wasn't just guilt, it was a sudden, terrifying clarity. His entire life, his schedule, his meals, his sanctuary, was held together by the very woman whose life was currently leaking out onto his lap. The SUV swerved into the emergency bay of the private hospital owned by the syndicate. Before the wheels had even stopped turning, Jin kicked the door open. He didn't wait for the gurney. He lunged out of the car with Kessia in his arms, sprinting toward the sliding glass doors. The hospital staff, used to seeing men with gunshot wounds and broken bones, froze at the sight of the great Jin Kairo, covered in wine and desperation, carrying a maid in a tattered uniform. "Save her!" Jin screamed as the nurses finally rushed forward with a stretcher. "If her heart stops, I will burn this city to the ground. Do you understand me? Save her!" As they pried her from his arms and wheeled her behind the swinging double doors of the trauma unit, Jin was left standing in the middle of the sterile, white hallway. For the first time in his life, he was truly alone. He looked down at his hands, stained dark with the wine that should have been in his own system. The realization finally took hold, brutal and absolute: the invisible shadow hadn't just taken a hit for her boss. She had held the mirror up to his own soul, and for the first time, Jin Kairo didn't like the man he saw reflected there. The power had shifted. The king was on his knees in a waiting room, and the only person who mattered was a girl whose name he was only just learning to say with respect. The sterile silence of the private VIP wing was broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the ventilator. For 4 hours, Jin Kairo had not moved from the hard plastic chair beside the bed. He had ignored 3 urgent calls from Chairman O and 2 from his security chief regarding the search for Minho. The empire was screaming for its king, but for the first time in his life, the king was paralyzed by a mystery he couldn't solve with a checkbook or a bullet. He watched the rise and fall of Kessia's chest, her skin appearing dangerously pale against the clinical white of the hospital sheets. Without the starched uniform and the pinned-back hair, she looked younger, smaller, and terrifyingly fragile. He stared at her hand, the one that had reached across the table and snatched his death from the air, and felt a wave of profound confusion. He was a man who understood transactions. You gave loyalty to receive protection, you gave work to receive a wage. But what Kessia had done defied every ledger he kept. When her eyelids finally fluttered, Jin leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the mattress. Her eyes, bloodshot and hazy from the toxins and the sedatives, struggled to find focus. For a moment, they drifted over the luxury of the private room before landing on him. "You're awake," Jin said, his voice sounding thin and unfamiliar to his own ears. He reached out as if to touch her shoulder but stopped, his hand hovering in the air. "The doctors, they pumped your stomach in time. The toxin was a neuroinhibitor. You're lucky to be alive, Monroe." Kessia didn't blink. She didn't offer a smile of relief or a whisper of gratitude for the world-class medical care he had provided. She simply watched him with a cold, flat clarity that made Jin feel more exposed than if he were standing in a sniper's crosshairs. "I've moved a security detail to this floor," Jin continued, speaking faster to fill the void of her silence. "And don't worry about the costs or your recovery time. You'll be taken care of. I've already had my assistant look into a bonus, a significant one. You saved my life, Kessia. I don't usually find myself at a loss for words, but thank you." The "thank you" felt heavy, like a gift he expected her to treasure. Instead, Kessia's dry lips parted, and she let out a sound that was half gasp, half laugh. It was a jagged, bitter sound that sliced right through his performative gratitude. "Don't," she whispered. The word was raspy, but it carried the weight of a mountain. Jin frowned, leaning closer. "Don't what?" "You need to rest, you're still." "Don't thank me," Kessia interrupted, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. She turned her head on the pillow to look him directly in the eye, stripping away the 3 years of feigned subservience in a single heartbeat. "I didn't do it for you, Jin. I didn't drink that wine because I cared if you lived to see tomorrow." Jin felt the air leave his lungs. "Then why? You nearly died. You saw the poison and you took the hit. If that isn't loyalty." It was an exit, she snapped, the fire in her eyes making him flinch. "I spent 3 years being a piece of the floor you walked on. I spent today being mocked by you for a smudge that didn't exist while a man sat 2 feet away preparing to kill you. I saw the green in that glass and I realized that if I died right there, at least I'd finally be the reason the party stopped. At least you'd have to look at me for once." She coughed, a painful, racking sound, but pushed through it before he could call for a nurse. "You want to thank me because it makes you feel like you've balanced the books," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and fury. You want to pay me for my loyalty, so you can go back to your spreadsheets and pretend I'm just a high-functioning tool. But you don't get to do that. You don't get to buy the fact that I chose a poison over your conversation. Jin sat back as if she had physically struck him. The diamonds, the bonuses, the taking care of her, it was all the same currency he had used to ignore her for years. He realized with a sickening jolt that he had humiliated her so thoroughly that she had viewed a lethal dose of neuroinhibitor as a fair trade for her dignity. I didn't want your thanks, Kessia whispered, her eyes beginning to close as the exhaustion pulled at her again. I just wanted to be the one who decided when the silence ended. She turned her face away from him, toward the darkened window of the hospital room, leaving Jin Kairo alone with the silence she had finally broken. He looked at his hands, the hands of a boss, a king, a god, and for the first time, he saw how empty they truly were. The dim blue light of the hospital monitors cast long, flickering shadows across the room, making the luxury of the VIP suite feel like a gilded cage. Jin had remained in his chair, the silence between them no longer the comfortable void of a master and servant, but a heavy, suffocating bridge. He had spent the last hour replaying every interaction they'd had over the last 3 years, trying to find the version of himself that deserved her sacrifice. He couldn't find him. You said you did it for an exit, Jin began, his voice barely a whisper, afraid that if he spoke too loudly, the fragile truth of the moment would shatter. But you could have just walked away, Kessia. You have a passport. You have eyes that see every security blind spot in my house. You could have left while I was gasping for air on that mahogany table. Why take the poison? Why choose the pain? Kessia shifted slightly, the movement causing a sharp wince to flicker across her face. She looked at him, not with the submissive eyes of Monroe, but with the piercing gaze of a woman who had seen the bottom of a grave and found it less frightening than his dining room. Because if you died, she said, her voice raspy but gaining a rhythmic, haunting strength, you would have died thinking you were a god who was simply outplayed by a smarter devil. You would have died believing that the only people who mattered in that room were the ones with seats at the table. I didn't drink that wine to save your life, Jin. I drank it to ruin your perspective. Jin felt a cold shiver trace the line of his spine. He was a man who dealt in the currency of fear and respect, but he had never encountered a motive so purely human and so devastatingly selfless. Look at the men who were in that room tonight, Kessia continued, her eyes tracing the sterile white tiles of the ceiling. Chairman O was already calculating how to carve up your territory before your body would have even hit the floor. Your brother Minho was shaking because he's a coward who uses chemistry to do what he doesn't have the spine to do with a blade. Every person in that room was a predator or a scavenger. None of them have a soul left, Jin. Not even you. She turned her head to look at him, her expression one of profound, weary pity. I needed to prove that in a room full of monsters, the only person with the dignity to act like a human being was the woman you told to stand in the corner and be silent. I wanted you to live so that every time you look at a glass of wine, or a set table, or a person in a uniform, you have to remember that your life was bought by the very soul you spent 3 years trying to ignore. The revelation hit Jin with more force than the neuroinhibitor ever could have. He realized then that Kessia hadn't performed a feat of loyalty, she had performed an exorcism. She had used her own body to prove that his world, the power, the logistics, the cold clinical arrogance, was a hollow shell. She had saved him not because he was worth saving, but because she was too good to let him be murdered by someone as hollow as himself. I am the only one in that room who had a soul to lose, she whispered, her voice trailing off as the exhaustion began to reclaim her. And I was willing to lose it just so you'd have to live with the knowledge that you owe everything to a ghost. Jin reached out, his fingers finally brushing the back of her hand. For the first time, he didn't feel like a boss. He felt like a beggar. He looked at the woman who had traded her safety for a moral lesson he was only beginning to comprehend. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a man who had finally been forced to hear the heartbeat of the person he had tried to turn into a machine. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over the city, but in the heart of the Cairo Empire, the old world had already ended. The why wasn't a secret anymore, it was a debt that could never be repaid with diamonds or gold. It was the heavy, beautiful weight of a soul that refused to be erased. The sun had not yet risen when Jin Kairo walked out of the hospital, the sterile scent of the VIP wing still clinging to his skin. He did not go home to change his ruined suit, nor did he sleep. Instead, he drove back to the estate, his mind a razor-sharp playback of Kessia's words. She had called him a man without a soul, a predator surrounded by scavengers. As he pulled into the gravel driveway, he realized she had been right about one thing above all else: he had been blind to the rot within his own inner circle because he was too busy looking down at those he deemed beneath him. He gathered his top 3 lieutenants in the soundproofed library. The air was thick with tension, the men standing at a distance, unsure if the boss was looking for a target or a scapegoat. Jin sat behind the heavy oak desk, but he didn't look at his spreadsheets. He looked at the empty air where Kessia usually stood to offer tea, a space that now felt like a gaping wound in the room's architecture. "Tell me about the wine," Jin said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that made the glass decanters on the sideboard hum. "We're testing the bottle, boss," one lieutenant stammered. "We've questioned the restaurant staff. They're clean." "The restaurant didn't kill me," Jin said, leaning forward into the light. "The restaurant didn't have a reason to sweat when the glass reached my lips." Kessia saw a shimmer. She saw a man who couldn't keep his hands still. She saw a coward. Jin closed his eyes, conjuring Kessia's description of the dinner. He remembered her mentioning Minho's jittery movements, the way he had flinched when she poured his drink, and the frantic rhythm of his pulse. He remembered the precise second Kessia had reached for the glass and the way Minho had looked as if he were watching his own execution. "Bring me Minho," Jin commanded. "And bring me his phone records for the last 48 hours. I want to know who promised him my chair." The cleaning was clinical. When Minho was brought into the room, he was already breaking. He didn't have the soul of a revolutionary, he had the desperation of a man who had overplayed a weak hand. Under the weight of Jin's silent, predatory stare, the associate didn't even last 10 minutes. He confessed to everything: the secret meetings with a rival faction, the vial of neuroinhibitor provided by an outsider, and the plan to step into the power vacuum the moment Jin's heart stopped. "You sat at my table," Jin said, his voice devoid of anger, which was far more terrifying. "You watched a woman who has served this house for years take a lethal dose of poison meant for me. And you sat there and said nothing. You watched her collapse, and your only regret was that she didn't die fast enough." Jin stood up and walked toward the window, looking out over the estate that Kessia had kept running with her invisible, tireless hands. He realized now that Minho wasn't just a traitor to the syndicate, he was an insult to the dignity Kessia had fought to reclaim. "Get him out of my sight," Jin said to his lieutenants. "The rules of the Kairo family are simple. If you strike at the head, you lose your own. But Minho didn't just strike at me. He made a mockery of this house's protection." As the guards dragged a screaming Minho from the room, Jin didn't feel the usual rush of satisfaction that came with eliminating a threat. The house cleaning felt hollow. He had removed the scavenger, but the house still felt empty. He looked at his hands, the hands Kessia had called soulless, and realized that the blood on them didn't wash away the debt he owed her. He picked up his phone and dialed his head of security. "Cancel the bonus I mentioned for Ms. Monroe," he said. The security lead paused. "Sir. You're withdrawing the reward." "No," Jin said, his eyes fixed on the sunrise. "A reward is for a servant. This is something else. Clear her contract. All of it. And find out where her family lives. I'm going to the hospital, and this time, I'm not going as her boss. The rot was gone, the traitor was handled, and the logistics were settled. But as Jin Kairo walked back to his car, he wasn't thinking about his empire. He was thinking about a girl who had traded her silence for a soul, and for the first time in his life, he was afraid he wouldn't be man enough to earn her respect. The hospital room was flooded with the unapologetic clarity of the morning sun when Jin Kairo returned. He wasn't carrying diamonds, and he wasn't followed by a trail of nervous assistants. He carried only a simple, high-end garment bag and a heavy silence that no longer felt like an insult. Kessia was sitting up, the color beginning to return to her cheeks, her gaze fixed on the skyline outside the window. She didn't turn when he entered, she no longer jumped at the sound of his footsteps. The power of the invisible shadow had evaporated, replaced by the weight of a woman who had already said her goodbyes. Jin stopped at the foot of her bed. He looked at the black and white uniform folded neatly on the bedside chair, the starched apron, the headpiece, the fabric that had acted as her skin for 3 years. It looked small and ridiculous now, like a costume from a play that had long since closed. "Your contract has been dissolved," Jin said, his voice steady but lacking the jagged edges of his usual authority. "The non-disclosure agreements are void. The remaining balance of your 5-year term has been paid in full, and I've added a trust for your family. It's not a reward, and it's not a bonus. It's a return on an investment you should never have had to make." Kessia finally turned her head. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, the catch, the logic he always used to justify his world. She found none. For the first time, Jin Kairo looked like a man who had been stripped of his armor and was content to stand in the cold. "I'm leaving today," Kessia said, her voice clear and devoid of the "sir" that had acted as her tether. "I know," Jin replied. He reached out and placed the garment bag on the foot of the bed. "I brought you something to wear. I imagine you'd prefer not to leave here in that." He gestured toward the uniform. "The car is downstairs. It will take you wherever you want to go. My security will ensure you aren't followed by anyone seeking retribution for Minho's failure." He turned to leave, but he paused at the door. He didn't look back, but his shoulders dropped just an inch, the only sign of the tectonic shift occurring in his heart. "For 3 years, I called you Monroe," he said softly. "I told myself it was for the sake of the household, but the truth is, I used it as a wall. If you were a title, I didn't have to acknowledge you were a person. I was wrong." He turned then, catching her gaze one last time. There was no command in his eyes, only a profound, quiet recognition. "Thank you for saving my life, Ms. Monroe. Not the boss's life, but mine." The use of her name, her actual name, paired with a title of respect she had never heard within the walls of the Kairo estate, hung in the air between them. It was the final brick in the wall coming down. Kessia felt a lump form in her throat, not out of loyalty, but out of the sheer, overwhelming relief of being human again. 10 minutes later, Kessia stood before the full-length mirror in the hospital bathroom. She had discarded the polyester uniform in the trash can. She was dressed in a deep emerald silk wrap dress from the garment bag, a color that reminded her of life, not poison. She unpinned her hair, letting it breathe, and wiped the last of the Maid from her face. She walked out of the hospital under her own power, her head held high. As she stepped into the sunlight, she saw the black SUV waiting. The driver opened the door, but Kessia didn't slide into the back like a passenger being transported. She stopped, looked at the driver, and simply shook her head. "I'll take a cab," she said. She walked past the syndicate car, past the guards, and toward the street. Behind the tinted glass of a window on the 3rd floor, Jin Kairo watched her go. He watched until she was just a speck of emerald green in a sea of city traffic. He knew his empire would never be the same. The silence of his house would no longer be a requirement, it would be a reminder of the woman who had taught him that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with the gun, it's the one with the soul. Kessia Monroe didn't look back. She had a new name, a new life, and for the first time in a long time, the only person she had to serve was herself. Kessia Monroe spent 3 years as a shadow, but one choice made her the most powerful person in the room. If you think Jin Kairo deserved to be saved, or if you think she should have let him drink, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to see the next chapter of Kessia's new life. Who do you think will come for the Kairo Empire now that the secret is out?